Thanks everyone for joining us. Tonight we have Evan Weiner, and he will talk about the early days of television. Thanks, Evan, for joining us.
Thank you, Paul, for inviting me. And hopefully the next time I do something with the library, it'll be in that room down the basement with all the chairs in front of a live audience. And thank everybody for joining me tonight. My name is Evan Weiner. I've been in radio and I've been in TV forever, since 1971, 50 years. Starting in Spring Valley High School at WRKL Radio with the Spring Valley High School show called Tiger Talk. I was on WNEW AM radio doing some news because John Lindsay told me he was running for Senate of the state of New York in 1978. And that was my entree onto WNEW. Interviewed Ronald Reagan for WNEW and the returning hostages from Iran for WNEW. And my last story there was the Brinks robbery in 1981. The early days of TV, my favorite TV show, Indian Head Test Pattern. If I saw the Indian Head Test Pattern, it might have been 2:30 in the morning after the late show on Channel 2, I knew I had it made because I had beaten my parents by a lot to going to sleep. It probably didn't do me any good to be up that late, but it was a small victory anyway. If you remember the early days of TV, first of all, we had a tough time watching TV because we didn't have one of these, that we just point and things changed magically. No. We had to go to the TV and actually turn the knob on and wait for the picture to warm up. And then when it warmed up, well, it either rolled, which means that you had to know where your horizontal hold was and your vertical hold was. But even before you got to that, you might have had some snow. So you would have to play, and I have rabbit ears behind me, but I'm not going to get it right now. You had to play with your rabbit ears, the antenna. And sometimes you get into a position like that, and somebody else would be in the room and say, don't move, don't move. Don't move at all because the picture is great. Well, yeah, but you can't stay like that. No, 5 more minutes of Dobie Gillis. I swear, that's it. That's all you have to stay there for. Well, you stayed there, and the other guy watched the show. But TV is rather easy now. All you do is point and click, and you got your picture on. TV used to, in the morning, you'd have the snow, you'd have the national anthem. You'd have the snow, you'd have the Indian Head Test Pattern, the national anthem. And if you were in New York, like me, you put on Channel 2 and watch Sunrise Semester. Or you watch The Modern Farmer, which was on Channel 4 or 5 back in those days. So that was TV back then. We worked hard to watch TV. RGB, 1928, General Electric Studios, the first television station in the world. GE figured out how to get TV working. It became WRGB. It's now known as WGY Television Schenectady. Now, I've been around for a long time. And in the 1980s, I was working with NBC and Mutual Radio. So I used to cover sports. And I used to go to places like Gallagher's on 52nd Street and 8th Avenue to cover things like boxing. So I got to know how it goes. So I am still friendly with his grandsons, Justin and Colin, and another grandson, Jared Kahana, who works for ESPN as a lawyer, and just heard from him a couple of weeks ago. And Cosell and I get to Gallagher's. It's noontime, and we're supposed to go to a private event, a boxing event, upstairs in the back room. But the room's not ready yet, and they let the people in starting at about 11:45. And I see Howard, hello, how are you, and all that. And Howard starts with normal voice, just a normal nasal twang. And he's, as the people are walking in, he starts talking about, and this may be where this talk started way back in the 1980s. When they write the history of TV, they're going to write about the 3 C's. Cronkite, Cosell, Carson, not necessarily in that order. Well, Howard did have a point, 1960s, 1970s, into the 1980s, that the 3 C's did an awful lot on TV. The three C's, Walter Cronkite, shown here November 22nd, 1963, announcing that the President of the United States, John Kennedy, had been assassinated and was dead. He makes the announcement, the glasses come down, he sheds a little tear, composes himself, glasses back on, and old Iron Pants, that was his nickname, Iron Pants, is back in the saddle. Business as usual. And with that, he became the most trusted man in America, believe it or not, just by taking the glasses down. I haven't watched CBS Evening News in a long time, but I know that that video was part of the opening of the show. And there's Howard with his omnipresent cigar, doing a Monday night football game, Howard Cosell. And here's Johnny. How many of you went to bed with Johnny? How many of you went to bed? You can admit it now. It's been off the air for, almost 30 years. How many of you went to bed with him? But you saw him with your 10 toes. Over the years, I've found out a lot of people went to bed with him. But there was one woman who said, I never went to bed with him. I said, you watch him? Yeah, he's great to iron clothes. But he was on between 1962 and 1992. 30 years, which in TV lives are about 19 different TV lives. And he went from 5 days a week, 90 minutes, to barely showing up at the end. But if you're a comedian, he can make or break your career. You do your stand-up routine, he invites you to the couch, starts talking to you. I know a guy by the name of Wayne Cotter, who is now about 63 years old, who went to Riverdale, he went to Riverdale High School over in Riverdale, or a high school in Riverdale. And he gets on the Carson show. He's about 30 years old. He makes it big on the Carson show. And sometimes he went on the show and he didn't even have to do a routine. The beginnings of television, Vladimir Kozma Zworykin invented the Iconoscope, which would be a tube for television transmission. He was at the time working for George Westinghouse's laboratories in Pittsburgh. Philo Farnsworth, you ever, as a kid growing up, or you remember back in those days, and remember the TV rolling, as they were called, blame him. Philo Farnsworth was trying to get a television picture transmission, and by 1927, he did. His television image comprised of 60 horizontal lines. And I'm used to remember counting every one of them, trying to adjust my TV when I was a kid. The first regular electronic television service was part of Nazi propaganda. It was in Germany. It began in Berlin, March 22nd, 1935. A little different system than Farnsworth. It was a 180-line system. It was on the air 90 minutes, 3 times a week, but it was there for one purpose. The 1936 Berlin Olympics, Hitler was going to be able to show the Aryan society was the greatest, the best. Look at all the medals that we're winning here in the Berlin Olympics, except this guy, Jesse Owens, kind of stole Hitler's thunder in 1936. But the 1936 Summer Olympics, the broadcasts were up to 8 hours a day. And if you had a TV in Berlin or in Hamburg, where the TVs were, you could watch the Olympics. But in the end, it was a bust. The Nazis intended to use television as a medium for their propaganda, but they never were able to sell a lot of TVs, and the project was eventually abandoned. Now, I was on Long Island. I was on Long Island, in Long Island, November of 2019. And I was talking at a senior's place, and we were talking about television. And there was a guy in his 90s, and he said, he looked at this picture, and it's from the 1939 World's Fair in Flushing Meadows. And it was the Pavilion of the Future. And in the middle of the pavilion, it's NBC, RCA, it's actually RCA. And RCA has a TV right in the middle of the pavilion. And there was a guy the other day who told me he was at the 1939 World's Fair and the 1957 World's Fair in Brussels. And he said he remembered the 1939 World's Fair. But anyway, this guy is in his 90s, and he said he's there with his parents, and they're watching this marvel. They can't believe what they're seeing. This is going to be in the home. And one of the NBC RCA people came up to his parents and said, we'd like to take him to the side room there. You don't have to, you could say no, but we want to put him on TV and you could see him on TV. And they gladly did. And he said at the age of 13, he was on TV. And his parents were absolutely thrilled watching him on TV at the New York World's Fair. Franklin Roosevelt was the first guy on TV, April 30th, 1939 in the United States. Greetings from the World's Fair. If you went to that pavilion, you got a flyer like that. Radio Corporation of America tells you what television will mean to you. And in Larchmont, if you had a TV, no problem. You were going to be able to see a show from Channel 1, which was the NBC station at the time. The antenna on top of the Empire State Building had the ability to send the signal 50 miles north, 50 east, 50 west, 50 south. You had a TV, you could watch a symphony, you could watch boxing, you could watch a award show, you could watch news, you could watch a baseball game, you could watch political candidates at a debate, and you would never, ever, ever have to leave your house again. And there is FDR. He was on television April 30th, 1939, gives a speech welcoming people to the 1939 World's Fair. Now, if in 1939 you wanted to get a TV, or 1940, you were. RCA was producing them, General Electric, Dumont, and the screen sizes were anything from 5 to 12 inches. This is a little less than 5. And the Dumont models featured 14 to 16 inch models. And the prices, they weren't cheap. $200 to as much as $1,000, now about $1,600 to about $8,000 for a TV. Some of the first baseball game ever seen on TV, Princeton against Columbia. It's on television channel 1, May 17th from Baker Field in New York. You might recognize this guy. His name, Walt Disney. And he is on the ground floor of television, both in the United States and in England. And he's shipping cartoons to England, and he's shipping cartoons to the NBC station Channel 1 in New York. And you have a TV and you find out there's a cartoon on, a Disney cartoon, and you're going to see, great, get to see Mickey, don't have to go to the movie theater or Donald, but no. You see Gus Goose. Now, Gus Goose, well, you know, Gus was kind of a slob. Food went everywhere. He was Donald Duck's cousin. I don't know how a goose and a duck could be cousins, but he was Donald Duck's cousin. I do a talk in about 1971, the opening of Disney World in Orlando, Kissimmee, Florida. And they got all the Disney characters out there first day. There is no Gus Goose, although he did come back in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So Gus Goose is the one. The Walt Disney cartoon, Donald's Cousin Gus, airs on the NBC experimental station, W2XBS, later WNBC TV, New York, Channel 1, Channel 4. And that was the first movie cartoon ever to be televised in the United States. First baseball game, the Dodgers, Ebbets Field, Brooklyn, against the Cincinnati Reds. Actually, there were 2 games, a doubleheader broadcast by Sarnoff and NBC, August 26th. That's the cover of my football book, which is now available as an ebook. And that is Benny Feathers of the NFL's Brooklyn Dodgers. A little unnecessary roughness there if you take a look, which is why I picked it out for the picture on my book, because if you look where that right fist is going, it's going right to where it would hurt if you're not wearing your jockstrap. But anyway, that's 1937-38 football, actually. It features the Brooklyn Dodgers playing the Pittsburgh Pirates in Pittsburgh. And that was when Cole and Steele were king in Pittsburgh. And look at the referee. Looks like he's ready to go out for a golf outing. The NFL's first television exposure would be a Brooklyn Dodgers Philadelphia Eagles game from Ebbets Field in September 1939. And there were about 1,000 TVs in the New York City area. CBS and NBC did begin before the start of the World War II. The war would delay television's progress. It was a temporary delay. When the GIs returned home, they wanted the GI Bill, they wanted a family, they wanted a house in the suburbs, they wanted a good job. If you got all that, you could buy a TV. A television would grow quickly. But before the war, March 10th, 1940, the Metropolitan Opera, the longest running show on TV, now on PBS, broadcast for the first time from the NBC studios at Rockefeller Center. And August 29th, Peter Carl Goldmark of CBS invents the color television system, the CBS color television system. It's kind of odd because NBC would go first, full-time color, before CBS. If you like commercials, you'll love this. This is the first commercial ever. It's before a Brooklyn Dodgers game at Ebbets Field. It's 2:29 in the afternoon on July 1st, and Bolivar Watches pays $14 for this ad. And basically, it's a camera showing the Indian head test pattern, except there's no Indian head there. There's NBC, RCA, and down around 4 or 5 o'clock, it says Bolivar. It is the first commercial ever on TV. On WNBT, Channel 1, a game before a game between the Dodgers and the Philadelphia Phillies. An announcement for Bolivar displays a WNBT test pattern modified to look like a clock with 3 hands and numbers going all around, showing the time and the Bolivar logo. By the 1950s, Bolivar went to animation, and I've been told Bolivar was a pretty good watch in its day. On December 7th, 1941, television swings into action with reports about Pearl Harbor being bombed. Ray Forrest on Channel 1 comes on and says Pearl Harbor has been attacked. It preempted regular programming, which was a New York Rangers hockey game that afternoon. And Channel 2, WCBW, broadcast special that evening from their Grand Central Terminal studios. The war board halts the manufacturers of television and radio equipment for consumer use. That ban would be overturned or lifted on October 1st, 1945. Television is reduced to 4 hours a week. But television would come back, and it would come back not with CBS, not with NBC, but with the Dumont network, Alfred Dumont, his network. And you see this poster of the Jackie Gleason show, which was done for trade magazines back in the 1950s, 1960s. And here's Gleason with his entire array of characters, Joe the bartender and the poor soul, and of course, Ralph Kramden, Reginald Van Gleason, Fenwick Babbitt, and the Loudmouth. And they were all on Dumont before Jackie Gleason went to CBS. Dumont was a very, very cutting edge television network. Dumont was the pioneer commercial television network, beat out NBC and CBS. First overall in the United States, first overall in the world, begins operation September 15th, 1946. And the first television soap opera would be on Dumont, Fairway Hill, October 2nd. Some of the shows you might have watched, not on the Dumont network, but elsewhere, included Ted Mack's original Amateur Hour, which started on radio with Major Bowes, Frank Sinatra, and the Hoboken Four. Never won Ted Mack's, or rather Major Bowes' Amateur Hour on radio. The Maury Amsterdam Show. Maury Amsterdam would eventually become Buddy Sorrell on the Dick Van Dyke Show, and his character was modeled after Mel Brooks, whoever Mel Brooks is. Captain Video and his Video Rangers. I did 2 talks at 2 adult homes, one in Stamford, Connecticut, the other in New Jersey, people who obviously didn't know one another. And a woman in Stamford said, ooh, I said, this is not car 54. What do you got to say? She said, I had the helmet on. My father bought me the helmet. I used to watch it with the helmet on. And this guy in Jersey said he didn't know who bought the helmet on, because I told him about the woman, but he had a helmet to watch Captain Video and the Video Rangers on Dumont. And the Arthur Murray Dance Party, which is a big show on in the 1950s. Just in case you're interested, not far from the library over at Route 22 by Mill Road, there is an Arthur Murray that is opening up Well, it was supposed to be open by now, but COVID kind of knocked that out. But it's still allegedly going to be open up. So if you want to do ballroom dancing, it's right on Route 22. And this guy, Ernie Kovacs. Ernie was on a local station in Philadelphia when somebody from Dumont, quote unquote, discovered him, put him on the Dumont network. Ernie Kovacs was a television genius because he figured out that little box, how to make it work for him. And whether it's blackout sketches or people in the bathtub, and if you watched Rowan and Martin's Laughing in the late 1960s, there was so much of Ernie Kovacs that was on that show. Kovacs was on Dumont. He was on the Today Show on NBC. He was on What's My Line on CBS. Eventually would go to ABC. Unfortunately, most of his work has been lost because back in those days, it was Kinescope, which was a camera that shot a TV screen, and it was often bad quality. Or if it was on tape, they would just tape over it, and all that stuff's lost forever. The stuff that's out there, his widow, Edie Adams, bought from ABC before they were going to destroy it. She bought the tapes. They were just going to tape over it. Lots of shows got taped over, including as late as 1967, the Super Bowl by both CBS and NBC. Dumont's problem was who was actually there. Kovacs, Gleason, and some others. They couldn't offer the big names like CBS did with Lucille Ball or Jack Benny or Ed Sullivan, or NBC with Milton Berle and Sid Caesar. From Dumont, you could get a relatively unknown comic by the name of Jackie Gleason or Bishop Fulton J. Sheehan. But Dumont was an interesting network because they, before CBS, before NBC, and long before ABC, which was a really weak network, they were the nation's window on the world because they had the first television network newscast. The first regularly scheduled show was the Small Fry Club with Big Brother Bob Emery. That was introduced into its first daytime schedule in 1946. And of course, they had him. One of these days, Alice, one of these days, bang, zoom to the moon. Well, look at her expression. Audrey Meadows. Yeah, I dare you. I dare you. I really, really dare you. By the way, she was not the first Alice Kramden. That was Pearl Kelton. And Jackie Gleason was forced to get rid of her because of red channels and communism. More on that a little later. It was on Dumont's Cavalcade of Stars that Ralph Kramden first threatened to send Alice to the moon. That skit wouldn't fly anymore. You couldn't do that skit in today's environment on television. So Dumont was the home to the first network soap opera, the first network newscast in Washington. And let me get Cosell back in here. Howard, introduce Roon. Roon Arledge. Get over here, Roon. Roon put up with Howard for a very long time, but he's at ABC. But Roon started with Saturday Night Football on the Dumont Network, and Roon was the brains behind the beginning of NFL Monday Night Football at ABC. But he cut his teeth on the Dumont Network Saturday night primetime telecasts of the National Football League. Dumont had Jackie Gleason before CBS, Bishop Sheehan before ABC, the original amateur hour before NBC. But there was a problem. Dumont, they made great TVs. They made absolute great TVs. We had one in my house, which really didn't work anymore until the 1990s when my friend Todd Ant, who's over at ABC Radio, decided he wanted to buy the furniture piece. And it was a furniture piece. I don't know what he did with the TV, but it was a furniture piece, you might remember. So it was high quality television sets and equipment. The problem with my TV is I didn't know where to get any tubes anymore. So I couldn't replace the tubes. Same thing with a Grundig radio I have from 1950. Unfortunately, Dumont is primarily remembered as a purveyor of low budget programming, which is unfortunate because most of television in the 1950s was low budget programming, but somehow Dumont is remembered for low budget programming, even though ABC, NBC, and CBS were offering the same low-budget programming. Well, maybe not Sullivan. The last non-sports program on Dumont was a game show called What's the Story on September 23rd, 1955. There were some sports contracts that were picked up by other networks at that time, and Dumont was gone. And it's a sad story about Dumont. There was a lot of fighting over the network. The network was never properly financed, didn't have good affiliates, and there was fighting over kinescopes and old videos and all. And one day some lawyer got sick of the fighting, drove up to the Bronx, went to the warehouse where the kinescopes were stored, loaded them into a truck, went down to the East River and just dumped them into the East River. And a lot of 1950s culture was lost because one lawyer was sick and tired of the fighting and decided to do something, ended the fighting, but deprived American culture of some slices of the 1950s. Now, there were 44,000 television sets in use in the United States in 1947. Some of you may remember the comedian Henny Youngman. Take my wife, please. Well, Henny Youngman, around 1947, is told by his agent that, and this story comes to me from a guy by the name of Bob Block, who I just heard from the other day. He's about 94 years old. He's in Reno, Nevada. He was an advertising guy in Milwaukee when Kohl's was just a local department store, and Selig Ford was a local Milwaukee car dealership. Who's the old man Selig's son, Bud Selig. You might have heard of him, commissioner of baseball. As far as Kohl's, you might be going to their store, or you might have heard of the kid, Herb Kohl, who was Bob's, I guess he was fraternity mate or something. I'm not sure about that. But anyway, so Bob owned a comedy club in Milwaukee as well, and he told me the story about Henny Youngman, how Henny Youngman died a bitter man. Bob was good friends with both Henny and Maury Amsterdam. They appeared at his comedy store, and Milton Berle didn't because he worked blue. But Henny is given a choice by his agent. He says, you know, they're moving Fred Allen's Texaco Star Theater to TV, and they're not interested in having Fred Allen on TV. They may want to try you, but here's a problem. Here's the problem in toto. You're supposed to be doing a show in England, royal performance in front of Princess Elizabeth, King and Queen. So I'm not telling you what to do because there are hardly any TVs, and that's a sure thing. So I'm not telling you what to do. Now, if any of you want to answer that, you could throw that into the box right now. What would you have done if you were Henny Youngman? Gambled on TV or do the sure thing, performing before Princess Elizabeth? I'll give you the answer in a few minutes. The longest running show on TV, this show, Meet the Press, hosted by Martha Roundtree. And this starts on radio in 1943. Now, I'm going to say this about that, to quote Richard Nixon. Let me say this about that. Women had more juice in the 1930s and 40s in terms of being on TV and radio than they did in the 1950s, 60s, into the 1970s. 1939, there was a woman named Claire Hollingsworth who was at the border for BBC watching the Germans roll into Poland. She just passed away a couple of years ago at the age of 107. There was Ruthie Gruber. Some of you might have heard of Ruthie Gruber. She was a photojournalist, took some of the first pictures of what the concentration camps looked like back in 1945. And she also, as a photojournalist, tried to put pressure on Roosevelt and then Harry Truman to get 1,000 Jews into the United States. They were thrown up into Oswego, New York, upstate New York. And they were told they were there temporarily, but eventually they were incorporated into the United States. Ruthie lived to about 102 years old. She passed away about 4 or 5 years ago. It's Pauline Frederick, who was in the Pacific Theater doing interviews during World War II. So there's Martha Roundtree, and she has she's the first woman Actually, she is the first host of Meet the Press, the first woman who hosted Meet the Press, and the last woman who is the permanent host of Meet the Press. It debuted on November 6, 1947, went from radio to TV, and both Martha and I have a couple things in common. I did some TV stuff on NBC, and I work with Mutual Radio, as did she. It was created, hosted by Martha Roundtree. She bought the time. Lawrence Spivak became a partner. He would eventually buy her out and be the host of Meet the Press forever and a day. And that's the way it was back in those days. Another show that starts around 1948 is this guy, old Stoneface. And well, my cousin was Jerry Stiller and Mara, and they were on old Stoneface's show 36 times or so. And Jerry has told me stories about Ed used to saying, that skit's too long, I want that out of your skit, etc., etc., etc. But he and Ed and got along well. Ed had this New York contingent that he always called upon in case somebody didn't show up, like Alan King, because he lived in Jackson Heights, got on the 7 train and was at the studio if somebody didn't show up. And he had all the people from the Catskills, and he had something for everybody. He had something for the kids, Topio Gigio, had something for the teenagers, the Beatles, Ed Sullivan. He had something for the younger adults, the Broadway plays and all that. He had for the empty nesters. He had the older acts like Ella Fitzgerald and Louis Armstrong. He was a pioneer when African Americans were not welcomed on TV, and welcomed them on TV. And he had, for the seniors, he had people like Jimmy Durante. He had something for everything everyone between 1948 and 1971. I'll give you one of Jerry's stories. Apparently he was on with Anna Marie Alberghetti, who was on Broadway, and that fit the Sullivan bill. You know, Broadway's dark on Sunday nights, we'll get a Broadway performer. And she gets on and she sings a song from whatever show she's on, and she's getting lukewarm applause. And so Ed is a former boxing ring announcer for the Golden Gloves. That's where he started, in this corner, in that corner. Come on, let's hear it for him. He won, all that other stuff. So Anna Maria Alberghetti is not getting the love that Ed thinks that she should be getting. So he starts, come on, come on, come on, come on, let's hear it, let's hear it, let's hear it. Let's hear it for Ave Maria. Ed Sullivan. It's better in person. Oh, back to Henny Youngman. So there I am in Detroit, and this is September of 2017, actually Dearborn, Michigan, at Henry Ford's Museum. And I said, oh, this is perfect for my TV talk. You could trust your car to the man who wears the star, the big red Texaco star, the Texaco Star Theater. And Henny Youngman has to make a choice. Do I go on that night, or do I perform for the Princess Elizabeth? He decides it's a once in a lifetime shot. I'll go to England. After all, he wasn't English. He was born in England, in Liverpool. And the network comes up with somebody else, Milton Berle. Now, there's a guy by the name of Larry Strickler. If you ever went to Pines or Brickman or Kutcher's, Larry was kind of the MC there during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even when I was speaking at Kutcher's in 2005 and 2006. And Larry was on that show as a child actor. He just celebrated his 80th birthday. And I told him about Bob's story, which he didn't know, about Henny and Milton. He said, Henny Youngman doing that show, I just never, ever would have worked. He said, Burl was a perfectionist, and he looked better in a dress. And he said, Burl told you what to do, exactly what you wanted. It always worked. And he could do all types of comedy, whereas Henny Youngman was a rapid fire, basically one-liners. One, take my wife, please. Blah, 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 blah. Larry said that Milton was the right choice for that show. And he became Mr. Television. Henny died because he thought he should have been Mr. Television. And Larry just shook his head. He said, there's no way. He said, Milton Berle was perfect. The Texaco Star Theater was largely credited with driving American television set sales. Starts in 1948, show ends in 1956. Berle gets a lifetime contract from NBC because he does so well. I met Milton Berle once, 1986, 1700 Broadway in Manhattan, where NBC Radio had its studios. And Berle was there, and we're in the same room together. I look up, there's Milton Berle. He was very, very nice to me. He wasn't rude to me at all. There's a lot of people who will tell you that he was rude to them. And he was there because he was going through an archive because NBC was doing 60 years worth of NBC radio. And he was going through stuff, and he asked me while I was there, and I said I was doing a report. And that was basically it. But you know, from 500,000 viewers or TV sets the first year to 30 million by the time the show ended in 1956. Of course, not everybody bought a TV to see Milton Berle. And I just did the talk in Vermilion, South Dakota in 1956. South Dakota finally got TV. People were getting TVs. Cities were getting TVs by the mid-1950s. The Texaco Star Theater, highest rated TV show, 1950 to 51. That was the first year Nielsen's ratings were used. In 1950, only after 2 years, NBC decides they're going to go after Ed Sullivan and the Toast of the Town. And they're going to come up with a show called the Colgate Comedy Hour. One of the writers on that show was Norman Lear, who ended up with All in the Family. It was going to be literally 3 separate 20-minute shows from New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. It was an engineering marvel. In New York, it was Eddie Cantor making whoopee. Ain't we have fun? But Eddie Cantor was a little past his prime by this point. It had been 25 years since he really was in his prime. And yeah, Joe Franklin from Channel 9. Oh, Martin Paints. I was up at Joe Franklin's office once. It was like the Collier brothers, newspapers everywhere. His assistant, Richie Ornstein, said, don't touch anything. He knows exactly where everything is. Poor Richie Ornstein, long suffering Richie Ornstein, his right-hand man. Anyway, Joe Franklin thought Eddie Cantor was the greatest entertainer of all time. He was old, wasn't getting ratings against Sullivan. In Los Angeles, Martin and Lewis are at the height of their career, and they are getting ratings for their 20-minute segment, although their popularity is beginning to decline. 1950, they were around since 1946, Paramount and the Paramount Theater and all that stuff, but they're going into the movies, and they're not running around as much as they were. And these guys, hey, I bet, Abbott and Costello, they were thoroughly overexposed. They were in Chicago. Now, how many times could you see Who's on First? How many times can you see Niagara Falls? You saw it all the time. There was the Abbott and Costello show on. There were the Abbott and Costello movies on. And they're all over the place. And they had nothing new. And so they're basically at this point, they're stale. People are tired of them at this point. However, I was at Teaneck, New Jersey at a seniors home. There was a guy in his 90s. He was an engineer, and he's trying to explain to me, he's a television engineer, an interesting place in Teaneck, because Bill Paley, who founded CBS in 1927, one of the guys that was there, Herbie, who fortunately survived COVID. I was really happy to hear that. He's in his 90s. He was William Paley's CPA over at CBS. And this guy, who was working television engineering production, he starts explaining to me about how this all operated with the microwave and coaxial cable connections and all. And I said, wait a minute. I said, you know what? I'm talent. I'm just talent. I said, I am the last one to know and the first one to go. They don't care about me. I'm talent. They care about you. You're an engineer. So you put all this stuff together. And he laughed. He said, you're absolutely right. There were 3 production companies set up, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They had a lot of talent on the show, but in the end, old stone-faced Ed Sullivan beat them out. If you were a kid in the 1950s in Scarsdale, you could go to Buffalo Bob Smith's house, and you wouldn't miss it in Scarsdale because he had a big totem pole right in the middle of his lawn in Scarsdale. Howdy Doody Show, and that's one of 3 Howdy Doodies. That starts in 1947, December 27th. That would last until 1960. And it was the first children's show telecast in color. And why was that? RCA was NBC's parent company, and they made color TVs. Now, there were some people who decided, well, color TV is much too expensive for us, so we'll take a screen, a color form type screen. We'll throw it over the screen, and maybe we'll get some colors to reflect. And I've had people tell me over the years doing this talk that they watched it like that. They also remember, they said, remember Winky Dink and You, where you used to have a screen on the TV and you just, yeah, I used to play tic-tac-toe on that screen because I had one of those Winky Dink and You things. Initially, it was on daily at 5 p.m. Eastern, and Bob Keeshan later became Captain Kangaroo, was Clarabelle. But you put that thing in color, why? The kids are going to nag their parents. I want a color TV. 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 And it was brought to you in living color on NBC. Now, how did cable TV start? Well, there are 2 stories, and they have nothing to do with each other, but they happened around the same time. Now, I'm looking at this picture, and I assume these guys are watching a football game in the fall, or they're watching the World Series. And you have a woman back there who doesn't care what's going on. But these guys are into it. And a lot of people I've been told, now those people, I started doing this talk over 20 years ago, those people were in their 70s and 80s then, who told me that they used to go in front of an appliance store and watch TV, not listen to it, just watch it, because they were in awe of television. Well, this is an appliance store, and they're trying to sell TVs. And these things, see, you know, you try to do something, and let me see if I can fix that. Oh, yeah, I can fix that. Because, you know, please stand by. That means you have a problem. It's claimed that the first cable television system in the United States was created in 1948 in Mahoney City, Pennsylvania, in the Poconos, by John Walson. And he had an appliance store. And he's trying to sell TVs. And he's having a lot of problems trying to sell TVs because there's something called South Mountain near his store, the tall mountains, and it's blocking the signals coming out of Philadelphia, Channel 3, Channel 6, and Channel 10. And he wants to sell TVs. And there was Walson, and actually a friend of mine by the name of Frank Carney, who now lives in North Carolina, worked for him as a lobbyist back in the 1970s and 1980s, because Walson was a cable TV executive by that point. So he builds a tower on top of a nearby mountain, and he runs wires like this to his store, and he plugs them into the back of the TV because he wants to demonstrate that the TVs work. So this is what he's doing in 1947, 1948. So he goes to an Army-Navy store. He buys some heavy-duty twin-lead Army surplus wire, runs the wire from the trees from a nearby mountain, South Mountain, to his appliance store, and voila, you could see Channel 3, KYW out of Philadelphia. You could see Channel 6, WFIL, Channel 6 out of Philadelphia. And you could see Channel 10, WCAU in Philadelphia. You could see them. And people said, well, I can see them in the store. Can you guarantee that this thing's going to work in my house? Yeah, I can. The line was extended to the appliance store and several homes along the way, connected to a community antenna system. And that's the beginning of one form of cable TV. The other form of cable TV, this is the summer of 2018. It's summer. It's Astoria, Oregon, which is the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean there. It's a maritime climate, and it's cloudy for most of the day, except for about 2 hours a day, and never gets above 62 degrees. Anyway, behind my right shoulder, where those 2 people are walking, Ed Parsons had an office. He owned a radio station in town, and he went to a convention in Chicago, radio convention in Chicago, and he was watching WKBK Channel 2 in Chicago. And he brings his wife with him to this radio convention and to see the TV. And his wife says, Grace Parsons, hey, are we going to get a TV here? And he said, well, there are no TV stations in the area. But Ed would buy a TV, put it in his office. And he knew a little bit about radio signals because, after all, he did own a radio station in Astoria, Oregon. And the reason I know this is that there was a train in Astoria, Oregon, that went from one end of town to the other end of town, 1 3/4 miles. And there's some interesting things that's in Astoria. And the guy pointed out that building. And I said, wait a minute, I heard about Walson in the Poconos. And he said, no, go check that out. There's a plaque there saying this is where cable TV started. And so that's why I know about this story, because I was in Astoria. So Ed Parsons in 1948. Grace Parsons wants to watch TV, and there is a station now in Seattle, about 80 miles as the crow flies, but longer as the roads wind around the mountains, because I've done the drive. My daughter lives in Seattle. Anyway, KRSC TV starts, and Parsons is beginning to wonder if he could pull down the signal. And he's playing around. He's got the TV. He runs this stuff, coaxial cable, from that antenna to his office. And he's playing around, and hey, he's got it. So Grace says, do you think we could have it in our house? And they didn't live very far. It's a town of 9,000 people, so it's not very big. And so he tries it, and it works. And here is where Grace Parsons makes the error. She tells everybody she knows, we got TV. And it becomes a problem because the Parsons become the most popular people in Astoria. And Ed loses his dining room. And Ed loses his kitchen. And Ed loses his living room. And Ed loses his bathroom. And something's got to be done. So he starts thinking, he gets another TV. Let's see if I could split the signal. He's got one in his office, one in his home. And he tells everybody, go out and buy a TV. I guarantee you, you'll get TV. And they do. And he charges them $3 a month to watch TV out of Seattle. And never tells the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, hey, I got TV. Wouldn't do that because he could lose his radio license. So literally, he's stealing a signal for pirate TV, and he never got caught. 1948, CBS TV News debuts with Douglas Edwards. The first network telecast of political conventions, June 21st, 1948, and the BBC covers the Olympics in 1948 in England. Lucy, please explain. Lucy and Desi. I've been asked by the Chester, New Jersey Library, and I'm doing it, to do a longer talk just strictly on Lucy the businesswoman, who's the brains behind the I Love Lucy show, with Desi taking care of all the business. Desi Lou is formed in 1950 by Desi and Lucy. The I Love Lucy show starts in 1951. Desi was not the choice that Bill Paley and CBS wanted to play her husband, because Lucy was an all-American girl from Jamestown, New York, and Desi was from Cuba. Lucy insisted that he plays her husband or there's no show. They eventually give in, CBS, and they are the first interracial marriage on television, Desi and Lucy. Lucy got in trouble because she was outed as a communist, but somehow was able to handle that and survive the Red Scare. Also, she was pregnant, except you couldn't say pregnant on television. So and also they did all kind of other business things. They were way ahead of the game. The I Love Lucy show starts in 1951, and arguably it's a show that did change TV. Jack Benny moved over from radio to TV. I love the radio shows. I started at WGRC Radio in Rockland County, and we used to do 2-hour blocks, Sunday afternoons between 12 and 2. The Benny Show, the Inner Sanctum, Burns and Allen, Old Time Radio, Theater of the Imagination. And in those days, I taped all of that not knowing that in 2018, I could listen to all of them for nothing. They're in public domain on the internet. So anyway, to make a long story short, I love Jack Benny on radio, on TV, like a lot of other radio people moving to TV. He's kind of stiff. He's old. He's 56 years old. You know, he's not 39, and he looks old. And all the gags that were great on radio because you had to visualize them were not great on TV. The one, the only Groucho with Fenneman, George Fenneman. You Bet Your Life. That started on radio, moved over to television. This story may or may not have happened. Groucho said it did. Groucho said it didn't. It may have been on radio. It wasn't on TV. There's no video, no audio of it, but it could have happened during the radio taping. Fenneman introduces Marion and Charlotte's story to Groucho Marx. Mary and Charlotte's story meet Groucho Marx. Groucho Marx meet the stories. The Story family had 20 children. Allegedly, when Groucho asked why she had chosen to raise such a large family, Mrs. Story is said to have replied, "I love my husband," to which Groucho responded, "I love my cigar, but I take it out of my mouth once in a while." I did this in Tarrytown, at a senior place in Tarrytown, and this woman is going like that to her husband. "What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that?" I'll tell you later. I Love Lucy, of course, a groundbreaking show. Now you might watch Jimmy Kimmel or Jimmy Fallon or Stephen Colbert. They all come out of this show, Broadway Open House, which was put together by Sigourney Weaver's father, Sylvester Pat Weaver, who was an advertising guy. And NBC is looking to fill time after 11:30, come up with Broadway Open House. And it's the template for the late night comedy shows you see today. Initially, Jerry Lester and Maury Amsterdam were the guests or hosts. Maury would leave the show. Lester would be the host. And somebody by the name of Dagmar, Jenny Lewis, would be his sidekick. And I just smile every time I say that name because he was a guy over in Glen Cove about 2 years ago, senior residence. And he was in his 90s and he starts panting. And I'm like, oh boy, this is not good because I'm giving this talk and they may have to do something with this guy and I may have to get somebody in here immediately. I said, "You okay?" He said, "Oh, I'm okay. I said, "Well, what's the problem?" "She was the best breather on TV. She could breathe. I always watched her on TV." And there was another guy also at Long Island. He's going like this to me, like this as I'm giving the talk. And I said, "Hey, what's wrong?" He said, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself. How old are you?" 93. I said, "Definitely be ashamed of yourself." And there she is. She was the Kim Kardashian of early TV. Jenny Lewis, Dagmar, who went from $75 a week to $1,250 a week on the show, and she had two assets. But they were bankable assets. And she's on the cover of Life magazine there. And so bankable were her assets that, take a look at this. This is a Coupe de Ville Cadillac from the mid-1950s. And the engineers over at General Motors decided they were going to have a little fun with some of their cars, some Chevys, some Cadillacs, and look at the front grille. If you look at the front grille, there are two nose cones. Why are they there? Nobody seemed to really know because aesthetically, they don't look all that great and they didn't do anything for safety, but they were nicknamed the Dagmar bumpers, named after Dagmar. Dragnet was a big show in the 1950s. Started in 51, came over from radio, lasted 8 years, version 2 in color, 1967 to 70. And there was supposed to be a revival in the 1980s, but Jack Loeb died from a heart attack. It had high ratings, a recognizable theme song. It was immortalized in the Lieber and Stoller song, Searching, with Charlie Chan and Royal Canadian Mounted Police always getting their man, Sergeant Joe Friday. Just the facts, man, just the facts. Dave Garroway was one of the early hosts of the Today Show, also put together by Sigourney Weaver's father, Pat. And here he is with the mascot, J. Fred Muggs, who's still alive in Florida, living the life of a retired chimpanzee in his 70s. Garraway hated J. Fred Muggs. The Today Show started in 1952, and 69 years later, if you're watching the show, it's the same show, hasn't changed. National news headlines, interviews with newsmakers, lifestyle features, light news, gimmicks, local news updates from the network's local stations, and weather. Educational TV started in Ann Arbor, Michigan. In 1954, the National Education Television operated from May 16th, 1954 to October 4th, 1970. It was later co-owned by the Ford Foundation and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. It was founded in 1952 with a grant from the Ford Foundation for Adult Education. It did not produce any programming, but was a program exchange unit, and it would move from Ann Arbor to New York in 1958, and Fred Rogers got money for it. You might remember in the 1960s, he went before Congress, begged for money to keep public television on, and got it. Some of you probably remember Romper Room, the Romper Room with Miss Joan. I forgot who the Romper Room woman was in New York. I never really liked the show. It wasn't for me. Mr. Doobie and all that other, and Magic Mirror, you know, or All My Friends, all that. Romper Bumper Stomper Boo, Tell Me, Who Are You? And the Magic Mirror and all that other stuff. But Romper Room was immensely popular, not for me, but for others. It lasted 41 years. It was franchised across the country. It was produced by Bert Claster, and his wife Nancy was a presenter. Each program opened with a greeting from the hostess and the Pledge of Allegiance. Steve Allen Show, the next in line after Broadway Open House, and there is Don Knotts, Louis Nye, Tom Poston. The Man on the Street featured Don Knotts as a nervous guy, Mr. Morrison, and you could see that in Barney Fife and Andy Griffith. Tom Poston, a man who could not remember his own name. Pat Harrington was a Italian golf player by the name of Guido Panizzi. Louis Nye was the smug Gordon Hathaway, and Bill Dana, whose brother was a doctor in Boston and grew up with a dear friend of mine by the name of Shelley Saltman, who was involved in pay-per-view TV and helped bring you the Battle of the Sexes on ABC TV in 1973 between Bobby Riggs and Billie Jean King. Bill Dana, who we grew up with, was Jose Jimenez. Bill Dana would retire that character in the 1970s. There's Elvis. He's on the Steve Allen Show, dressed up in tails, and he's singing to a basset hound, also in tails, singing Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog. He wasn't too happy with it, but he needed the TV exposure on the Steve Allen Show, and he got it. Jack Parr, he came after Steve Allen before Johnny Carson. And he once got in trouble telling a joke about a WC, a water closet, or a bathroom, which didn't make any sense because I watched the old Price is Rights with Bill Cullen on Buzzard TV from the 50s, and Dove soap, or Dove, was a toilet bar, but he couldn't say WC, and he got suspended for that. Oh, and there is Dick Clark. Dick Clark, Channel 6 in Philadelphia, on October 7th, 1952. WFIL-TV, Philadelphia, had a show premiere called Bandstand, became American Bandstand, changed its show from bandstand, big band music, to teenagers dancing to popular records. Dick Clark became the host in 1956. The Week ABC television network picked it up in 1957. Very quietly, in 1956, that became one of the first color TV shows ever. Yeah, it's these old TVs. What are you going to do? Hold on. Let's see if I can fix it. Oh, yeah. Oh, that's my wife. And that's 1982. And this is my honeymoon. And we're at Disneyland in Anaheim, California. And what is this doing in TV talk? Well, it has a lot to do in the TV talk. See, Walt Disney was having some problems back in the mid-1950s. He wanted to build an amusement park, and there were amusement parks all over the place, like Rye Playland up the road from the library in Larchmont, and other places all around the country. And a lot of people didn't think that Disney, whatever Disney was going to build, was all that great an idea. There were plenty of playlands, one in San Francisco, cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And who needed another amusement park in the Orange Grove, 60 miles south, rather 40 miles south of Los Angeles? But Disney kept persisting and persisting and knocked on every door in Hollywood and got to Paramount, who owned ABC. 1954, Paramount had just 14 affiliates. CBS had 74, NBC 71. And so ABC was looking to do something with their network. Dumont was out of business by this point. So ABC's, the people at Paramount said, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to put up some money. You build Disneyland in Anaheim, but you got to give us something. And here's what you got to give us. You got to give us 2 shows. Disney, The Mouse That Roared, Walt Disney, but you got to give us the 2 shows. One, we want a show from Disneyland. The other, we want a kids show to compete with Buffalo Bob Smith. It became Disneyland and the Mickey Mouse Club. And quick, name all the Mouseketeers besides Annette. You can't. Only one person's ever done that when I've talked about this. ABC would become profitable because of the Mickey Mouse Club. And they would buy Westerns and detective series like The Untouchables from Desi Loeb. Lucille Ball liked that one and said, let's do that one. And others. And meanwhile, at CBS, another Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball, you could link them to this show, Twilight Zone, because it was shot on the Desi Lou lot. Rod Serling starts in 1959 with the show on CBS, and he used storytelling to explore the human condition and culture of his time, 59 through 64. Sonny Fox died of COVID earlier this year. There is Sonny Fox. He was part of the kiddie shows I watched in the New York area that some of you might watch. There were some uncle shows, not in the New York area, except for Uncle Floyd in the 1970s. The Uncle Show, the uncles wanted to run a smooth show, but they never did because personalities disrupted the performance. They were on across the country. In New York, there was Sandy Becker on Channel 5. He did characters, Norton Nork, the big professor. I watched him because he had Bugs Bunny cartoons on. Joe Bolton, Officer Joe Bolton in the Three Stooges on Channel 11, and Captain Jack McCarthy with his Popeye cartoons on Channel 11. Chuck McCann was on both Channel 11 and Channel 5, and Soupy. Now, Soupy, the most famous bit in all of kiddie TV, except his show wasn't for kiddies, was January 1st, 1965. Soupy didn't want to be there, but he was there doing a live show. He's got 40 seconds to kill, and he's got to figure something out in 40 seconds. So he's got to stretch it, and he stretches it. And he says, hey, kids, you know, your parents may still be asleep, and this is in the afternoon. They weren't asleep, but your parents may still be asleep. And so why don't you tiptoe into their room and go into your father's pocket and go into the wallet and get these green pieces of paper with funny looking people with beards on it and send it to me, and I'll send you a postcard from San Juan. Soupy got $80,000. $80,000 his fans sent him. Sonny Fox told me that Soupy did return most of the money with the envelopes that had names on it, and the rest went to charity. He was suspended, but there was such an outcry that he was back within 2 weeks. You couldn't do the show today. Your show or shows with Sid Caesar, and here's the reason why you couldn't do it. Nothing about political correctness, although there's that great skit with Howard Morris and Uncle Goopy, and the takeoff on This Is Your Life, and it's up on YouTube. It's about 8 minutes long, and it's hysterical. But the reason you couldn't do it, they had some writer named Mel Brooks. I never heard of Mel Brooks. Neil Simon, Danny Simon, Mel Tonkin, Lucille Kalin, Selma Diamond, who I know from the 60s as being on, say, the Merv Griffin show or the Mike Douglas show back then. Joseph Stein, Michael Stewart, Tony Webster, Carl Reiner, Larry Gelbart, and Woody Allen. You couldn't put together that kind of writing staff. You couldn't do it. You didn't have enough money. The same reason you couldn't put the Carol Burnett show together anymore today. She had 170 people. You couldn't afford it. And you couldn't afford these people except for maybe that Mel Brooks guy. Nat King Cole was on the show of shows, the Jackie Robinson of TV. Well, maybe yes, maybe no. He was not the first African-American to ever host a TV program. That was the singer, pianist from Juilliard and the British territory, Jamaica, Hazel Scott, and also the vocalist, Billy Daniels. But Cole was popular. He was a frequent guest on your shows. His show would start in 1956, taking over Berle's spot. But he had no national sponsor. Rheingold Beer in Hartford in New York was a local sponsor. Coca-Cola in Houston, Regal Beer in New Orleans, Gallo Wine, and Colgate toothpaste in Los Angeles. Nat King Cole would say Madison Avenue was afraid of the dark. The party is over. December 17th, 1957. After about 15 months, Cole's gone. The party's over. Montage of photographs featuring Cole and the guests who appeared on the show, including Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Harry Belafonte, Sammy Davis Jr., Frankie Lane. That's an hysterical piece. If you go up to YouTube, it's out there, and so is this. Cole was offered to stay on TV Saturday nights at 7 o'clock. NBC was willing to keep him going without sponsors. The Singer Sewing Machine Company wanted Nat's Tuesday night 8 o'clock slot for an adult Western, like they needed another Western on TV called The Californians. David Sarnoff, the founder of NBC, 1926, said to Nat, Saturday nights. And Nat said, no, don't want it. It's a less desirable time. Hazel Scott, Dumont TV. This is groundbreaking. African-American woman hosting a TV show on Dumont. But June 22nd, 1950, Scott's name appeared in red channels. Communist. And red channels came out of the Hollywood Reporter, which in 1947, totally unsourced, said these are communists that are running around Hollywood. Red channels came after that. Hollywood Reporter, the son or grandson of the guy who wrote it in 1947, issued a formal apology for this guy putting out, without attribution, all these names and ruining a whole bunch of careers. Scott appeared voluntarily before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, September 22nd, 1950, said she wasn't. Hazel Scott's sponsors left. Dumont canceled the series a week later. She fled to Europe for her career and came back in 1970 on General Hospital. She was once married to Adam Clayton Powell III, the congressman. There was a lot of ethnicity on television. Back in the day, there was an Italian show. I remember Mama was about a Norwegian family. Bueller, the cook of the kitchen. There were 4 different Beulahs on ABC. Ethel Waters, Hattie McDonald. That came over from radio and lasted on week ABC TV for 2 years. And Amos and Andy, played by African-American actors. The show, which started on radio on WGN on 720 on your radio dial, moves over to TV with African-American actors. That started in 1927. There were 52 episodes filmed between June 1951, April 1953, sponsored by Blatt's Brewing Company of Milwaukee. But there's a problem. The NAACP does not like Kingfish. They do not like Amos and Andy, and said if the show was going to continue, they were going to boycott Blatt's beer. The first year, the show finished 13th in the ratings, 51-52, 25th in 52-53. Blatt's knuckled under to the protest, and it ended it. And it also put African-American actors out of business. It went under lock and key in 1966, and out of syndication, hasn't been seen since then. The women of TV, the early days of TV, Dinah Shore, See the USA in Your Chevrolet. Betty White, here with her show out of Los Angeles, KNBH, KNBC now. Our Miss Brooks, Eve Arden, She Can't Get Her Man. Look, My Little Margie, starring Gail Storm. The Executive Secretary, which was another Desi Lou show with Ann Southern. Donna Reed show. Donna Reed's important because Donna Reed is the first woman who really is the central figure in her family, making the decisions in the show. December Brides, Spring Byington. Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Goldberg. That comes over from radio to TV. It's about a Jewish family assimilating into the United States. And there's a problem, not with Gertrude Berg, the originator of the show, but to her left, to her right, your left, Phillip Loeb. The radio show goes to TV in 1949. Gertrude Berg created the show, played Molly Goldberg. It's the first situation comedy on TV. But the show is killed because Phillip Loeb is accused of being a communist. Without Loeb on the show, and she fought to keep him on, and they sent him money after he was gone, the show stumbled on NBC and on Dumont TV. And Phillip Loeb not only was canceled on the show, but he ended up killing himself. And you might have a book in the library about Zero Mostel. He wrote the book, actually. He talks all about his friend Phillip Loeb and how the blacklisting that was going on ultimately forced Loeb to take his own life, which he did. This guy, Arthur Duncan, was on the Lawrence Welk Show from 1964 to 1972, but he started out on the Betty White Show. And Betty White is called in 1954 to talk about the show. We love you, Betty. Everything's great about the show, except for one thing. You got to get rid of that guy, Arthur Duncan. Betty White says, well, you just got rid of me, and the show ended. Oh, there was a plethora of Westerns on. As you know, there's James Gardner as Maverick, Playhouse 90, Cowboys and Indians. Gary Moore had a daytime show for housewives. Had I've Got a Secret, also had a nighttime show, which starred Carol Burnett. Art Linkletter, soap operas, variety shows. Oh, there's Lucy. You could not say pregnant on TV. Lucy wore pants on TV. Most people couldn't wear pants on TV if they were women, but she wore pants on TV. Lucille Ball is pregnant, but you can't say pregnant on TV since CBS censors said the word pregnancy was too obscene, even the context of married characters who happen to be married off screen. TV parents typically were showed underneath the cover in separate beds. Oh, and there's Mary Tyler Moore. That's Bob Crane in the background, who went on to Hogan's Heroes. And look, she's wearing capri pants. Carl Reiner talked about, I had Laura in pants, Laura Petrie. This is actually Mary Tyler Moore talking. I had Laura wear pants because I said women don't wear full skirt dresses to vacuum in. Mary Tyler Moore told TV Guide in 2004, CBS said, you know, we're afraid that housewives are going to be a little annoyed because she looks so good in pants. So they made Carl Reiner, the show's creator, promise not to let me wear pants in more than one scene. We went along with that for about 3 episodes, and then finally, I was just wearing pants. You couldn't wear pants on TV, although Lucy did. Oh, let me just dial here. Look what we came up with. Maynard G. Krebs, the first beatnik on TV. The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis featured teenagers as the stars. Gary Marshall, who put together Happy Days, used the same formula in Happy Days. Maynard has a goatee, wears a ripped sweatshirt, has a love of jazz, and uses the like vocabulary. He was the first beatnik, and they pretty much nailed it. The quiz show scandals, Mr. Stemple, Mr. Van Duren. Stemple takes a dive. Jack Barry, Dan Embright on the show 21. He would get he would talk to Jack O'Brien of the New York Journal American, tell them he took a dive. There was a congressional hearing about the quiz show scandals, and Congress amended the Communications Act in 1934 to prohibit the fixing of quiz shows, and quiz shows are more tightly regulated than news shows. Barker had a show in the 1950s. This is Jeopardy! Merv Griffin had graduated the Goodson Todman School of Game Shows. He had hosted Play Your Hunch, filled in for Bud Collier on To Tell the Truth, and filled in for Bill Cohen on The Price is Right. And he wants to do a show, and he's doing a quiz show, and he's having all kinds of problems, and he's driving with his wife, Jillian, and says, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. And she says to him, give them the answers. Let them ask the questions. This is Jeopardy! started in 1964, and now the big question is, who's going to be the next permanent host of Jeopardy? My vote, if I had a vote, Aaron Rodgers. I think he could bring in younger people, which is what they need. John Cameron Swayze was the first real anchorman on television. The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours. But those happenings face some sponsorship. R.J. Reynolds, the tobacco company, handed its news production over to NBC, or actually NBC handed its news production over to R.J. Reynolds, and the company would choose the name of the nightly news show, The Face, John Cameron Swayze. It begins February 16th, 1949. It ran every night for 15 minutes at 7:45. John Cameron Swayze and the I know Cameron Swayze used to work at WCBS Radio. John Cameron Swayze and the Camel News Caravan pioneered the news format that is still used today, but there was some censorship. News reports were not allowed to show no smoking signs. The only news figure permitted to smoke a cigar, Winston Churchill. NBC asked R.J. Reynolds if he could broadcast news specials about the Korean War in 1950. The advertiser said no. Speaking of censorship, in 1963, CBS Reports wanted to do what was going on in Birmingham with the protests and everything else that was going on during the Civil Rights Movement. William Paley said no, and Howard K. Smith, who put together this report, was fired because they did not want to put a show like that on CBS. Speaking of CBS, Edward R. Murrow, who eventually got kicked out of CBS, well, actually, his resignation, took on Joe McCarthy because he's watching his friends get blacklisted. And on the See It Now show, there was a report on Joe McCarthy, March 9th, 1954. And the next month, McCarthy would face off against Morrow. The movie Good Night and Good Luck, you may have that in the library, produced by Mark Cuban and George Clooney. Morrow on the second show was not allowed to use CBS money to promote the show or the CBS I logo. So he promoted the show by himself, and he faced off against McCarthy and literally brought down the senator. Morrow would have repeated conflicts with CBS. His last show, Harvest of Shame, 1960, it's up on YouTube. You can watch it. It's about California migrant workers, and it was done in 1960. And you, other than being in black and white, could be the same show today, 2021. This changes politics, and TV begins to mature somewhat. It is the studios of WBBM in Chicago. It's September of 1960. There is Howard K. Smith. And it is the first debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And this is where Does He Look Presidential comes into play for the first time. Look at Kennedy. The suit matches the backdrop, whether it's in color or in black and white. Every hair is in place. Look at Nixon. He looks like he just got off the IRT. July 23rd. 5:50 in the afternoon, unair-conditioned car, packed in like a sardine. He's got a 5 o'clock shadow. He's sweating profusely. And he's got a bad knee. He banged his knee on the campaign trail and could barely walk. And you could see he's favoring that left knee. I did this in college. I had to do this in college as an assignment. I had to listen to this and I had to watch it. Nixon wins the debate if you listen to it. But you cannot keep your eyes off Kennedy if you watch it because he is so immaculate. That debate would change politics. TV would become a great political force because of the visuals. TV matures in the 1960s, or so we think. This is Newton Minow. He was the head of the Federal Communications Commission starting in 1961. He's still around. He's still living in Milwaukee. And, oh, wait a minute. That's the skipper of the SS Minow. Wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, let's talk about Newton Minow because Gilligan's Island's TV boat was actually named for Newton Minow because the Gilligan's Island executive producer Sherwood Schwartz thought that Minow was ruining TV. Minow was the chairman of the FCC and gave a speech called A Vast Wasteland about American TV. And we leave where no man, or should we say woman, has ever gone before. Star Trek, no woman has ever gone before, but that's Captain Kirk, just celebrated his 90th birthday. So who was the first Trekkie? Lucy, the head of Desi Lou. Lucille Ball had two proposals for shows in 1964. One was from Gene Roddenberry, Star Trek. The other, Mission Impossible. It was clear Star Trek was going to be expensive to film. Mission Impossible, no brainer. Get it right on TV. It's a great show. But Star Trek is a problematic show. Initially, Lucille Ball thought the show was a series about traveling USO performers like she used to be, entertaining the troops. Then Roddenberry said, well, it's Wagon Train in space. The board of directors looked at it and said, no, let's not spend any money on this. Let's really not spend any money on this. It's just a waste of money. And as a studio, we're just hanging on. Lucy said, produce the pilot. I want it. Well, they do. The Cage, it flops. But NBC saw something in the pilot and said, hey, we like that guy with the pointy ears, Leonard Nimoy. My friend Shelley, who I talked about before, about Riggs and Kings, he grew up with Leonard Nimoy up in Boston. Leonard Nimoy's father, Max, was the neighborhood barber. Also grew up with Leonard Bernstein and David Susskind and Barbara Walters up there. That's another talk. Anyway, so the second pilot, where no man has gone before, or should we say where no woman has gone before. Leonard Nimoy would be the only one. Lucille Ball said, let's do this again. The board of directors said, you're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. We don't have to do this. It's costing way too much money. Lucy said, do it. And they did. And the rest is history. How much is that little thing worth? Billions of dollars, that franchise. By the way, Lucy would get out of the Desi Lou business in 1967, sell it to Engulf and Devour, or rather Gulf and Western Paramount, and start her own company, Lucille Ball Productions, which basically was just her show, maybe a couple movies here or there. Oh, and by the way, Lucy, how smart she was. The Here's Lucy show. CBS wasn't doing any color shows in 1963. She filmed it in color. Why? It would be worth more in syndication. Lucy was the pioneer of syndication. Anyway, thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me. That's me on Politics Live on ABC back in 2005 with Jeff Morrell and Sam Donaldson. Jeff asking me a question there. And Jeff went on to the Pentagon after that. So the floor is all yours. Thank you, Paul.